This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on the activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we are speaking with academic Cetta and foreign policy analyst Daniel about the Malta Migration Archive, which is a project they've been working on. We discuss the Maltese government's refusal to save refugee lives in its own search and rescue zone. We talk about how the Maltese government ignores civilian rescue ships and pressurises commercial ships not to rescue refugees and people on the move. And we talk about how it organises pushbacks with the so-called Libyan coastguards within its own search and rescue zone. Cetta and Daniel are going to tell us all about the Malta Migration Archive and how it maps all of this stuff. They're also going to tell us why it is important to expose and combat the Maltese government's silence on all of this. So, before we get into today's episode, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast. It's not just a podcast, it's also a news blog with investigative stories, news reports and interviews. So go to thecivilfleet.com to find out more about that. And if you like what the Civil Fleet is doing and you would like to help us to continue to platform the amazing people that we have had on this podcast, then you can do so by making a micro donation. Go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet and you can make a small donation there and you'll get access to a bonus episode. So that website is ko-fi.com/civilfleet. You can also share the podcast around, give us a review on podcast apps and tell your friends about it. All right, let's get on with the show. Okay, Cetta and Daniel, are you ready?
We're ready.
All right, let's get on with the podcast. Cetta and Daniel, thank you very, very much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
Thanks for having us, Ben. Great to be here.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, it's really good to get you both on. I've really wanted to get some Maltese people on the podcast for a long time. We've managed to get you on. And today we are going to speak about the Malta Migration Archive, which I believe you've both worked on. And we're going to talk about the situation in Malta, pushbacks, and the Malta Search and Rescue Zone, and all kinds of things, I think, today. So before we get going, let's... can you just tell us about yourselves? I know you're brother and sister. I know that you're Maltese, but I don't know much else than that. Maybe we'll start with you, Cetta. Could you tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. I'm a scholar and an activist. So I work at the University of Edinburgh. I've been researching migration and borders and the Central Mediterranean in particular for more than 20 years, almost 20 years now. I'm also involved in various activism here in Scotland, but also in Malta. The Migration Archive comes out of that activism in Malta. I'm involved there also in the Hiblu 3 coalition. That's me.
Oh, brilliant. We've had an episode on the Hiblu 3 that was a while ago, and I don't remember who it was, but in the show notes, people listening can look at the notes and I'll have the information there. How about you, Daniel?
Hey Ben, I'm a foreign policy analyst by trade, by practice, and a social activist in my free time. Got involved with the Civil Fleet when they were based here in Malta, when the Lifeline was detained here in particular, and then the Sea Watch briefly. I did some advocacy work with them and got to know some of the land crew, and then eventually went on Mission 19, which was detained in Catania in Sicily, and since then have been working with Alarm Phone and Sea Watch as an activist basically, and working a lot on projects like this with my sister.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, don't think we've had Mission Lifeline on the podcast. We've had Alarm Phone and Sea Watch many times on the podcast. So it's really good. You've all got great connections. This is really good. So thanks for coming on today. And I'm really thankful to Ollie, I think it was, who emailed me about the Malta Migration Archive. It's really, really great resource. I think we'll talk about that first, though, we should talk about kind of the situation in Malta in general. We haven't had any Maltese people on this podcast, as far as I know. So it's really good to get the view from actual Maltese people, because from what I see, from the work that I see, it seems that the government in Malta doesn't ever, very, very rarely, get involved in rescue cases. It seems to be involved in pushbacks and with the Libyan coastguards, or the so-called Libyan coastguards. So yeah, this is a very, very broad question, and you can take it however you like. Maybe we'll start with Daniel. I don't know. Could you tell us what's it like, kind of politically, in Malta in terms of migration?
Yeah, that's a very good, broad question. Where do we begin on that, Cetta? So I think in some ways, yes, we're an island. We're out in the Med by ourselves. I think that there was a time when there were more migrants arriving. That's decreased significantly since in the past five or so years. But clearly the rhetoric of the government has been one of being an island out on its own in the Mediterranean. Hasn't had much assistance from its EU partners on any type of migrant redistribution programs, and so I think there's a bit of a fortress mentality here, which is perpetuated by government rhetoric or amplified by government rhetoric. Jump in on this, Cetta.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we could go back to when Malta joined the EU in 2004, and just before that, the island saw an increase in people arriving by boat. Of course, it's important to note that Malta is an island, and there has always been migration, right? To Malta and from Malta, there continues to be different forms of migration. This is a normal phenomenon. But the government since that time, since the early 2000s, has constructed a crisis around migration, and there's been this perpetual sense of crisis constructed by the government around migration, regardless of the number of people arriving. So as Danny said, in many ways, due to the non-assistance at sea we've seen in the last 5 or so years, and there's been this decrease in the number of people arriving, but still there's this rhetoric of crisis around migration. There's also that rhetoric of crisis around migration, despite the fact that the government has implemented a very large labor migration program in Malta. So there's this real mismatch around the realities of migration and the rhetoric of the government. And so since 2004, there's been different, I was trying to think about the most recent kind of very clear non-assistance and pushbacks that are happening in the Maltese seascape, the Maltese search and rescue zone, and thinking about more historically, going back to 2003, there's been a continuation of those policies with some differences, right? So I started looking at this around a case in 2007, which was called the tuna pen incident, where 20 or 30 men were abandoned, their boat was sinking, and they clambered onto this tuna pen, and they were abandoned there on the tuna pen for 2 or 3 days. And so you can see how this carries on, this abandonment at sea, this disregard for lives at sea, this reluctance or total refusal to rescue people in distress. There's these different geopolitical dynamics that occur with Italy, for instance, how much Italy is willing to to rescue people within Malta's search and rescue zone. Obviously, geopolitical dynamics with Libya as well, and I'm sure we'll get into that more. And those change over time, so the government practice changes somewhat. But there's this constant of a racist policy of leaving people at sea in distress, which obviously results in shipwrecks and deaths and results in harm more broadly. Maybe I would just add quickly before I let you jump back in, Danny, is that, of course, what's happening at sea is also connected to what happens on the island. So people arrive on the island and they are similarly faced with violent border policies. So they're detained. Malta has had one of the harshest detention policies in Europe over this time. They're detained. There's been an emphasis on fast-track deportations in Malta more recently. There's been these very violent public raids on communities in Malta, communities now that have been there for years, if not decades, who are still made precarious by the government and are still subject to these raids and detention and deportation. And we can talk about it too in terms of the archiving. One of the things we wanted to do was to connect these spaces and these different forms of border violence.
Yeah, like sorry, Daniel, were you going to say something?
I was just going to pick up on one point that Cetta made, because I think it is a lens into the sense of the general public here in Malta. Cetta mentioned we have 150,000 migrants working on a visa here, laborers that are basically the governments that we've had, the Labour government that we've had for over a decade, has structured an economy that requires the import of 150,000 people, and we've had massive GDP growth. We've had one of the highest GDP growths in Europe for the past 7 years running, or something like that. So the powers that be have purposefully set up an economic structure that requires the import of a large number of people. It's about a fifth of the Maltese population, somewhere between a fourth and a fifth of the Maltese population are foreign laborers on a visa, many of them third country nationals. And I think in the Maltese mindset, these two the different migrant bodies become conflated, yes, and there is some, let's say, there is some struggle and some tension that people feel having so many migrant laborers in the country, and they conflate that issue or that large number of people with the very small number of people that we have arriving irregularly that are seeking asylum. And I think, as Cetta kind of noted on the side, the government uses this to their advantage. So they recognize that there's a growing intolerance, let's say, for such a large migrant population on the island, and they provide an outlet for that intolerance by targeting a very small group of very vulnerable people that aren't documented, while at the same time, greasing the wheels for the capitalists on the island to import large numbers of laborers.
That sounds a very similar situation to the UK, right? Constantly blaming the small boats that they talk about a lot in the UK. Yeah, that was a really good. Thank you very much for that answer. That was really detailed. And another thing, actually, we should probably talk about before we get into it is just so I think most listeners will be aware of Malta's search and rescue zone. But as I understand it, the central Mediterranean, so the sea between Italy and Libya, is kind of carved up between 4 different countries. I think you've got Italy, Malta, Libya, and Tunisia. Is that right? Am I describing that right?
Yeah, that's right. And Malta's search and rescue zone is very large in comparison to its land mass. And so it's 250,000 square kilometers that stretches across the central Mediterranean. Basically, anybody leaving Libya, definitely Libya, and also Tunisia, but definitely Libya on a boat will pass through Malta's search and rescue zone. And Malta has responsibility in that zone to coordinate rescue and ensure that people are disembarked in a safe place. Responsibilities which it is not upholding at the minute. It also has a duty, of course, to not refoul people, to not push people back, and return people to a place where they face danger. The search and rescue zone is a central part of the government's narrative, I would say, about Malta facing this unfair burden around migration, and that they couldn't possibly take responsibility for this whole area. There have been suggestions that Malta should give up part of the search and rescue zone, which the government flatly refuses. The search and rescue zone coincides with the flight information area as well, from which Malta makes money. The air traffic control charges on planes flying through that area bring the government revenue, and there's also some suggestions around oil and fishing exploration rights in the SAR zone. So the government does this hypocritical thing where it says, "Oh no, this zone is so large, and we couldn't possibly take responsibility for all the distress cases," although they have very clear responsibility for all the distress cases under international law. But then they won't engage in any discussion about giving any of it up. Yes, Danny, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just tiny bit about the geography as well. There are places where our search and rescue zone, the Maltese search and rescue zone, overlaps with the Italian search and rescue zone in the north, in particular, in the north of our SAR zone, and also which let's say, complicates responsibility for rescue, or at least allows the government to have a rhetoric of complicated responsibility for rescue. But also there's the issue of Lampedusa, because it's like a small patch of Italian SAR in the Maltese SAR, and it becomes relevant when we're talking about disembarkation and the sort of historical debate between the Maltese government and the Italian government on the safe port of disembarkation has been that the Maltese position has been that it's the geographically safest, or it's the closest geographical safe port, and that's often that is often the case Lampedusa, whereas the Italians maintain that since the vessel in distress was in our search and rescue zone, then we're responsible for providing a port of safety in Malta, which we sort of very rarely have done.
Is there I'll just say before I ask this question, for people listening, Daniel said SAR zone, which is a shortening of search and rescue, SAR. People use it involved in refugee rescue and this kind of support missions and stuff all the time. I might just jump in with, I think we might use some other terminology like that. I might just explain later on. My question I was going to ask is there a kind of tension between Italy and Malta, between the governments over the migration? I know Italy's got a pretty far right government. I'm not sure about Malta's, but is there tension between the two over this is our zone, no, this is your zone, or could you kind of talk a bit about that?
Yeah, there is tension, and it manifests differently, erupts sometimes as more tension or less. So, for instance, when Italy ran its Mare Nostrum program, where it was rescuing people throughout the central Mediterranean, that was, say, a low point of tension, right? Where the Italian government was carrying out rescue and disembarking people in Italy. Then there are moments where Italy and Malta play this kind of political football with people's lives at sea. So the very big shipwreck on October 9th, 2013, comes to mind, a case where over 250 people died, more than 60 children died, because Italy and Malta wouldn't take responsibility and kept trying to pass the buck between them about who was responsible to go out and rescue these people. And so, yes, that tension emerges differently depending on the governments in power, depending on, their positionings towards their domestic citizenry as well as to the EU. So, it's a relatively kind of complicated picture about how these governments position themselves. At the minute, I would say maybe the tension is fairly low in the sense that Malta has just taken over the past 5 years this position of we will not rescue, we will not go out, we will not search for people, we will not rescue. In very few cases they do, but most of the time they don't. And if boats are, and so then we have other actors stepping in, right? We have the civil fleet, of course, a very important actor in terms of carrying out rescue for people in distress in that area. But also the Italian Coast Guard is rescuing people around Lampedusa, and as Danny said, in that overlap, in the north of Malta's SAR zone, there's an overlap with the Italian SAR zone. So there they are also rescuing people.
Yeah, also to just pick up on that, and because you asked, Ben, about the nature of our government here in Malta, it has been really for decades now just a fairly center neoliberal capitalist government. It's not nearly as, we don't have the populist rhetoric and populist movement that you see elsewhere in elsewhere in Europe, which is a blessing. But also to pick up on the relationship, as Cetta said, there are moments of tension that flare, and this political rhetoric that's thrown back and forth, where the Maltese PM will scold the Italian foreign minister and back and forth. But there's also clearly coordination and cooperation, and the nature of the relationship has been pretty opaque in many ways for activists and people on the ground. For example, there was a time, and I think it's still the case, that the Italian Coast Guard does quite a lot of rescue within the Maltese search and rescue zone, and then disembarks in Italy. And so there was hypothesis or discussion, at least, that there was a secret deal of some kind between the Italian and Maltese government. I think maybe that would have been about 8 to 10 years ago under our Prime Minister Muscat, and there was speculation about what that deal might have looked like. So there was speculation that the Maltese government had given up oil exploration rights in the north of our territory, in exchange for the Italians doing rescue and disembarking in their own ports. But that was never proven. We don't know what the details of the deal were, if there was one at all. But the fact that the Italians have and continue to rescue in Maltese search and rescue zone and disembark in Italy suggests that there's some form of deal, or at least some form of informal cooperation that's taking place.
Yeah, I've often wondered about that, about why Italy always, well, it doesn't always, but often comes to the rescue, but the Maltese armed forces never, very, very rarely do. I think your study found that only 2 or 3% of cases were picked up by the armed forces of Malta. This is a really side question, but the armed forces of Malta is the Coast Guard, right? They're the same. They're one and the same thing.
That's right.
Good. I've been reporting on that right all these years. So let's go on to the archive then. So the Malta Migration Archive is a really great resource. I think it's got a map, and I'll have a link to it in the show notes. And when I share this on social media, I'll include the link to it. It has a map, and it has lots of dots of cases, of distress cases in Malta's search and rescue zone. I think it's a really great resource, and I think I will end up using it quite a lot. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe Cetta, or could you tell us about the archive, and then I'll ask more probing questions later.
Sure. Maybe before we start, I'll shout out to Ollie Kuster, who you mentioned at the start, who got in touch with you, who is our amazing website designer, who designed the website, did the graphics, and is all around a sound person. So we started this project more than a year ago now, and really, I had been thinking about the lack of archiving, the lack of memorialization in Malta. So as Danny was saying, if you go to Malta, in part because of this labor migration program, it's a really diverse, multicultural place. But you wouldn't know, being there, about what's happening at sea. You wouldn't know about the non-assistance. You wouldn't know about the deaths at sea. You wouldn't even really know that people have arrived by sea. And so after a trip to Lampedusa in 2023, where I was really impressed by the memorialization happening there, by the archive there, I thought about the need for that to also more systematically document what was happening. So both Danny and I are also involved with the SAR Malta network, where for a number of years now, with a larger collective, we've been trying to pressure the government to rescue people when people are in distress, to call the AFM, to remind them that people are in distress, to inform government officials, to tell the media about it. And so we were doing that in a kind of ad hoc reactionary manner to when people were in distress at sea. And this was really an attempt to try and have a resource that covered a longer period, that was more systematic, that could reflect some of these broader patterns to show that this is systemic practice of the government. It's not one-off kind of distress cases or emergencies. And so we started working we've worked with a number of partners in the civil fleet and in Malta as well, which has been a real strength and pleasurable part of the project, I would say. So on the civil fleet side, we were really privileged to be able to work with the CMRCC SARchive, so the civil fleet's SARchive, their database arm, and also with Alarm Phone and Sea-Watch as well. So it's thanks to them that we have the map that you talked about, an interactive map that that marks the distress cases in Malta Search and Rescue Zone between 2020 and 2024. And we hope to continue updating that as we move forward now. So that's an important part of the archive what we were trying to do more broadly was to counter this lack of information about distress cases at sea, to really counter this almost complete veil of secrecy the government has around what happens at sea. They don't publish any information on distress cases at sea. Even when people arrive in Malta, there's very little information about people being rescued by the AFM, by the Maltese Armed Forces, and brought to Malta. And the press has filed freedom of information requests and been denied them on the grounds of national security. And so really it was an attempt to have a resource for people and paint a picture of what was happening at sea. And the other thing we wanted to do was to connect this, as I mentioned already, connect the violence at sea with violence that people face when they arrive in Malta. So to think about the detention of people in Malta, their marginalization socially and economically, to think about that as connected to the border violence at sea, to see the connection in the racism that exists between those two, for instance. And there's a lot of really great work done by organizations and activists in Malta once people arrive. And so we worked with a number of organizations there, Spark 15, Additus, Movement Graffiti, in order to create another part of the archive, which we call Spotlight, where we spotlight particular migration issues in Malta. And there we've also platformed testimonies of people on the move, people who have crossed the Mediterranean, both about that crossing, but also when they arrive in Malta. And that was testimony that organizations in Malta had already collected and had made into their videos, for instance, testimony of people once they've arrived. So that was really thanks to those organizations that we were able to have this other part of the archive. And broadly, I guess we were trying to both show the violence of government policies at sea and on land, but also reflect this tenacity of the human spirit. This, people really, yes, tenacious and struggling against these violences, these different forms of violences, in order to create a life in Malta. And of course, to always think about how migration is fundamental to humans, is not something that should be criminalized. Yes.
That was a great answer. Yeah. And I don't know, Daniel, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, what I would add is a bit of a description of the website itself and what you as a user are presented with. I don't know if that's jumping the gun, of getting ahead of things.
Oh, go ahead.
So yes, as Cetta said, there's been a complete lack of transparency on what's been going on in our search and rescue zone. And the power of the website is just to bring a lot of data to light about what's happened in our search and rescue zone, or what has been happening for the past 5 years or so. And so as a user, the first thing you get to is a map, which has a bunch of red dots in the Maltese search and rescue zone. And each one of those red dots represents a distinct distress case that's occurred sometime in the past 5 years. There's always this issue of people becoming numbers, and the problem with stripping humanity from people. So we have sections on the website where we describe, but I encourage the user to really try to imagine each one of those red dots as a vessel in distress with a certain number of people on it. I mean, it could be anywhere from in the teens to in the hundreds. And so if you click on one of those red dots, then you'll get a bit of data about the distress case, and so you'll get a sense of how many people were on board, what type of vessel. You'll obviously see where in the search and rescue zone. The dots represent the last point of distress, because often the migrant vessel would have sent out multiple distress calls over the course of its drifting, let's say, through our search and rescue zone, and so we've chosen the last point of distress as the point to highlight on the map. And so all of these dots represent 80,000 people. So going back to the human aspect, we're talking about 80,000 people over 5 years on vessels in distress in our search and rescue zone. And if you click on the dots, effectively one of two things happen. Either you get a bare bones set of data about that case, or for I think about 100 of the cases perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, Cetta, but I think for about 100 of the cases, then you get a more extensive narrative. So we've gone through and really for the cases that we had more extensive information on, but also the cases that we thought were either exemplary in the sense that like cases that were run-of-the-mill normal practice. We tried to highlight some of those, and also, of course, you get some of the more egregious cases where there were shipwrecks and deaths, or we also, in particular, tried to highlight the increasing number of pushbacks, forced interceptions, and pushbacks that are happening from within our search and rescue zone, which I hope we can talk about in more detail. And so if you find a case, if you click on a case and there's a narrative, then you can open up the case page and you get a narrative description of what happened and quite a lot of links, often the social media links that were live in time, from Alarm Phone or Sea-Watch or members of the civil fleet that were trying to call on the authorities to do rescue to conduct rescue at that time, but also any other media links that followed. And we've tried to link some testimonies to cases as well. And so that's all a work in progress and continues to be a work in progress. And we really intend for the archive to be a collaborative space. And so we have a portal set up for people to contribute their testimonies, their experiences, their data, their information, and we can try to make these case narratives even richer in that way. And as Cetta also said, we'll continue to add cases as we go now, periodically as we move forward. That's a lot, but the other brief thing I would say is that the other thing that's relevant on the timeline is that there's a box for maps. That's relevant on the map is that there's a box for map settings, and you can toggle a number of different features there. You can select the time frame, and you can play that time frame. So you can say, okay, I want to look at these months specifically in 2023, and then you can press play, and it'll start from the beginning. And as the months go by, the cases will pop up on the map. So you can narrow your time frame down, but you can also apply two important filters. And one is the filter, they're outcome filters, and one is the filter for AFM rescue. So if you select that, the cases that were rescued by the AFM change color and appear distinctive on the map. And the other is for forced interceptions and pushbacks by the so-called Libyan coastguard. And similarly, you can toggle that and those show up. And so you can play with those filters and the time frame as well. So for example, you could toggle Libyan coastguard interceptions and choose a certain time frame, and it would play through that time frame, and those interceptions would pop up. Obviously, as we'll get into it, those interceptions have increased significantly over time in direct or indirect correlation with AFM rescues decreasing drastically over time.
Yeah, like the map is amazing, and I think it's a really great resource, particularly for journalists or for anyone interested in it. It's brilliant. Although there's so many things that struck me when you two were talking there, and also from when I was looking at the map, I'll try and get some of them out of my brain. Like one of the things I thought when I've been looking at it is there's so many cases. There's quite a lot of cases in there where we don't know what's happened to these people. They had either disappeared or maybe they were rescued. We just don't know. And I think that's such a powerful reminder, and also like a counterpoint to people who say, like, often people will accuse the civil fleet of like being a taxi service and it's such a stupid argument, but like this map makes it really clear, like this just boats so frequently coming across that we just don't know anything about. There was no one there to get them. We've got their distress case, and that's really tragic. So I think it's really good for highlighting that. And one of the ways I've been using it is I clicked on it and I've been searching it via people. So I know you were talking about, Daniel, about people becoming numbers, and journalists can be really, really bad for that. But like I clicked on it and I was just looking at so there was one case, the case with the most people on, I think, but it was the one that struck me the most anyway, was 500 people. And I think it was 2023, and I think they were pushed back. It was May 23. I've just got it on my screen now. And they just, I think I think that alarm phone was involved. Seabird is a plane. Actually, we've had them on the podcast. Anyone listening and you don't know who Seabird is, check out the show notes. That case really struck me, and I was like, just 500 people sent back to Libya, and I think this what's so good about that map is it can bring these, and I really like the details that you have when you click on and you get like more of a story of what's happened. I just think it's excellent. Was there any, like, we can keep talking about the map, but I just wondered if you could talk about, are there any cases in particular cases that really struck you that struck you whilst making this map?
I think Danny might talk about a couple of cases, but maybe just before Danny, I'll talk about the data and what's there and what's not there very quickly. Yes, as I said, we have this data because of the Civil Fleet, right? And the Civil Fleet's archive in particular. It is not a full picture of what happens at sea. So there are more...
I just want to clarify something. Like, the name of this podcast is the Civil Fleet Podcast, but when you're referring to the Civil Fleet, you actually mean the whole activist-led refugee rescue and support networks. I'm just in case people are listening for the first time and they don't know, it's not this podcast.
Yes, good call. Yes, so because of the network of NGOs at sea, the planes that we've talked about that are activist-led NGO organizations, Alarm Phone, who runs the hotline at sea, it's because of those actors that we have this partial picture of what happens at sea. The government does not share, the Maltese government does not share this information. The cases, we have about 1,800 cases of distress across those 5 years, 2020 to 2024, but it is a partial picture. It is not all the cases. And so, for instance, we do see in that data, we can see the decrease in AFM rescues, which correlates with an increase in Libyan interceptions within Malta's search and rescue zone, illegal interceptions. We have some evidence of Malta's coordination with Libyan actors to allow for that. We can assume that Libyan actors aren't coming into Malta's search and rescue zone without Malta's knowledge, at least. And so what we've tried to do in the archive is to also complement what's on the map with other data we have. So, for instance, we know from the Civil Fleet as well, from the Civil Fleet Echoes publication, that last year 21,000 people were intercepted and pushed back to Libya from throughout the central Mediterranean. So some of these other sources, also the number of deaths, the IOM has a missing migrants project, which counts deaths, also an undercount, definitely, but I think it's 1,200 people at least who died in the central Mediterranean last year. And so we've tried to complement what's on the map with these other sources, which we've put on our timeline, that try and show this broader picture as well. And you mentioned just to one more point, you mentioned also that on the map what we highlight is, in terms of outcome, is AFM rescue and pushback to Libyan Coast Guard. And then we have this other category, which can be a number of things, right? NGO rescue is an important one. The network of NGOs in the Civil Fleet is carrying out rescue all the time. And thousands of people get rescued by them. There's also the Libyan Coast Guard, as we said, the Libyan Coast Guard, merchant vessels, but there are also shipwrecks, of course. There is death because of the lack of rescue by the Maltese government. I think Danny will talk about some particular cases.
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into the details and read you a narrative of two cases, but I hope that we can just talk about a couple of different cases a little bit in the abstract and use them as an entry point to talking about two things, namely failure of the AFM to conduct timely rescue, and secondly, forced returns to Libya. And so the first case that I want to bring up is a typical case, let's say a run-of-the-mill case, a daily case of a failure to coordinate rescue and failure to rescue by the AFM. And so that case is, on our website we give the cases handles, and they're arbitrary, but we give them handles just so they have a name that we can refer to and other researchers can go back and refer to. So the first case I'm going to talk about is DC-12. If you go on our cases part of our website, then you can look it up. It happened on the 1st of May in 2023, sort of in the southeast of the Maltese search and rescue zone. And that's a case in which there were 36 people on a fiberglass boat. We don't know exactly from where they departed in Libya, but they departed from Libya. And they contacted alarm phone, which with the distress call, they contacted alarm phone, and alarm phone, as they do, relayed that information to the Maltese and the Italian authorities. And thankfully, in this case, there was a civil fleet asset, in this case a Sea-Watch plane called the Seabird, and Sea-Watch has a couple of reconnaissance planes, which are absolutely crucial assets for documenting what's going on in the search and rescue zone, and a lot of the information that we have on our website, it comes from observations made by these reconnaissance planes. So there was the Seabird 1 was out at sea and flew toward the distress case, and in the process made contact with a container ship that was in the region. As the civil fleet often does, they try to coordinate with merchant vessels that are in the region if they can't get to a distress case in time, or if there's a merchant vessel closer. And so Sea-Watch coordinated, or the Seabird 1 communicated with this merchant vessel, the Marco Polo. And the crew of the Marco Polo agreed to change directions and move toward the distress case. A couple of hours later, the Seabird 1 got in touch with the Marco Polo again. The Marco Polo told Seabird 1 that the Maltese Rescue Coordination Center had taken over the case, had taken over responsibility for coordinating rescue, and had told them to stream away from the case. That told them to divert to their original course and not move toward the case. Long story short, the same thing happened with another merchant vessel. Then Sea-Watch contacted another merchant vessel, the NJ Moon, and they were also told not to perform rescue by the Maltese RCC. Yes, the RCC being the Rescue Coordination Center. Sorry. Eventually, after being at sea for well over a day, the 36 people on board were rescued by Geo Barents. That's one of the civil fleet ships operated by Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, and they were disembarked in Italy, in La Spezia. And so again, a normal case from within the search and rescue zone. And what do we have in this case? We have a failure of the Armed Forces of Malta to coordinate with the civil fleet. The Armed Forces of Malta, or Maltese Rescue Coordination Center, pulling away commercial vessels when they were willing and able to move toward a vessel in distress. Yes, we have delayed rescue and certainly greater risk of exposure to trauma and death at sea. We have Italian rescue within the Maltese search and rescue zone, and disembarkation in Italy, right? So I don't know if you want to pause and talk about this case first, or I move on and talk about the other one. Maybe better we stop here a moment.
Yeah, no, that was a really good case, because that was something I been thinking I need to ask about. This is commercial ships, and what Malta has done, and also Italy, with its new, I think it's called the Pandiosi Decree, which we talked about in many of these episodes, but briefly is a new decree in Italy where they force ships after they rescue to sail way north up in Italy, and they've even done this with commercial ships, right? But yeah, this is a really good. And I think, what was the name? There was a case, I think it was 2019 or possibly earlier, where a commercial ship rescued some people and Malta refused for days and days and days to let them come to land. And like and Malta's policies is really affecting commercial ships as well, which is something I don't. This podcast is focused on activists and left wing and all that kind of stuff, but it's really, I think it's quite interesting to think about how these policies are forcing commercial ships as well to, like, they don't want to do it because they're going to lose loads of money. They're going to get in trouble. The staff, if they're in charge of the ship, will get in trouble with their boss probably for being diverted miles and miles away. Yeah, I don't know if you could say anything briefly, I guess, maybe about, I mean, that case you highlight is really interesting case because it involves commercial ships in that way.
Yeah, I think Cetta could say more on it, but one thing I would say immediately is that my impression and my experience is that sailors put a lot of value in the laws of the sea, and that if there are people in distress at sea, sailors want to rescue and ship captains want to rescue, and that's generally, I think, in the culture, let's say, in the moral code. And so I think there's quite a willingness on the part of sea captains and sailors on merchant vessels, commercial vessels, to conduct rescue. However, the ship-owning companies are naturally put in a difficult position when they're on a commercial voyage and they take time out to do rescue, and then there's then the authorities, in some cases which told them to do rescue, refuse to provide a port for them to disembark. Just to say, I cannot remember the last time that a commercial or merchant vessel disembarked people in Malta. In my mind, it's been years since that's happened. And so, yes, so you get these standoff situations where you have a commercial vessel out at sea for days with people on board that they've rescued, and nobody's providing a port of safety or a safe port, and obviously that's a lot of money lost for the commercial companies. And so what they've done is my understanding is that they've shifted their shipping patterns away from areas where they're likely to run into migrant vessels in distress, and just essentially pulled the shipping route up a little bit further north, to my knowledge, to avoid exactly these types of scenarios.
Yeah, I would just echo that there's been a clear policy by the Maltese government to try and deter merchant vessels from performing rescue. So the case you mentioned, Ben, where merchant vessels did rescue. It was around COVID times, I think, that they did rescue, and then they weren't allowed to disembark the people for weeks, and so and coupled with Danny's case that he just described of the RCC telling merchant vessels not to rescue, diverting them away from these cases, you see how the governments are trying to deter rescue by merchant vessels, and it tallies with the decree that you mentioned, Ben, the Italian practice of assigning ports in northern Italy for NGOs, the same sort of practice of emptying the sea, right? Of making sure that these rescue vessels, these possible rescue vessels, are not in the place where they could carry out rescue.
Yeah, it's really I think there's a term. The term is like necropolitics or something about who gets to die and who doesn't die, and yeah, that is a really clear case of that, I guess. Did you want to say something, Daniel?
Yeah, it makes me want to bring up an abstract I'd like the audience to imagine now. So like we've described the map that we have on our website, yes, full of red dots representing 80,000 people that were largely not rescued when they were in distress. And I want people to imagine that there's the same map, the same region. But now on that map we have dots that represent distress signals that were sent out by European citizens on pleasure crafts or on yachts or this is my way of saying that, look, the armed forces of Malta are very capable of doing rescue, and they do rescue, and I respect them for doing rescue. They've rescued people that I know. They've rescued friends of mine at sea, and so they're a competent agency that does rescue. And so if we had a map of European citizens on pleasure crafts, then it would be full of green dots. They would all be rescued. The Armed Forces of Malta doesn't think twice if a Maltese citizen is out at sea on a vessel and that vessel is in distress or it's sinking, and they conduct rescue, and they do it regularly, to be clear. They do regular rescue around our islands. Every day they're rescuing people. European tourists and Maltese fishermen or whatever it is, yes? And so if we think about these two maps and the contrast between these two maps, then we really have to acknowledge or reconcile with the fact that what we're dealing with here ultimately is racism, right? We're dealing with racist policy at sea that kills people.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is something that I talk about on this podcast all the time. Like, if there's European people in distress, it's not a problem. Like, you will be rescued.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a scholar, an abolitionist scholar, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who defines racism as premature exposure to death. And I think you can see that in the Mediterranean, right? Even when people don't die, they are exposed to death in this way because of these policies. And I would also say that, as Danny has mentioned, the AFM does rescue, and this policy and practice of non-assistance and pushback is a political decision of our government above the heads of the AFM. So I think it's important to make that point as well, that this is a wider political decision about who to rescue.
Absolutely, yeah. And that there very likely are many people within the AFM, many high-ranking members in the AFM, who have the moral backbone and framework that they want to conduct rescue, but they're prevented from conducting rescue. I think that's very likely. Mm-hmm. Also, just to drive home the point, what we're really talking about is the composition of the people on board the boat. Right, the composition of the people on board the boat, our government's notion of their nationality, their ethnicity, the language they speak, where they're coming from, that determines the likelihood of rescue. That's clear. I was in a meeting last week in which the Maltese ambassador on migration was speaking, and he was talking about the composition of people on the boats, and he was saying, well, some of these boats, for example, they're full of Bangladeshis, and we know that Bangladesh is a safe country, as if the AFM is making a decision, let's say from helicopter, and saying these people look like Bangladeshis, and therefore we're not going to rescue them. We're going to coordinate an intervention and have them forced back to Libya. I was shocked to hear the ambassador on migration talking about this with a complete lack of awareness of refugee law and asylum law, that even if it was a boat full of Bangladeshi people, that they have a right to apply for asylum, and we can't determine whether or not they deserve asylum, whether or not they're refugees or deserve some sort of asylum status by looking at them from a helicopter while they're packed in a boat, right? We have to bring them on land and talk to them, and so it's really evident that the government is making decisions based on who they think is on the boat, with the biggest distinction being EU citizens versus third country nationals without a visa, of course.
Yeah, that's it. Like that comment by the minister there is really crazy, because then they rescue Malta as a safe country, and they're rescuing them. Like, it's just the fact that you're from a safe country doesn't mean you don't need rescuing, right? That's just absolutely crazy. so crazy.
Absolutely. That's the yeah. So you took it a point further. Then absolutely. I mean, even if you don't deserve asylum, you deserve to be rescued. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just wild.
And then I think you had another case you wanted to talk about, Daniel.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have any other thoughts on that, Cetta, on this issue of?
No. I guess to echo that I think sometimes also there's been some suggestion that people, when the AFM does rescue, they rescue people because they know they can attempt to fast track deport them because they are nationalities in the same way like Bangladeshis, who they can say they're from a safe country, quote unquote, and so they detain them. There's very little access then to people in this first 2 weeks of detention in Malta, and so they don't get legal representation, and the government attempts to fast track deport them. So, I mean, a worrying trend of the government trying to make distinctions between distress cases, and it was really good to hear about people at that event that Danny spoke about, reminding the migration ambassador that all distress cases are distress cases, and Malta has a responsibility to coordinate rescue of those distress cases, that the right to rescue is a fundamental right. It's not negotiable.
Yeah, sort of continuing on it, because I think it's really important. I'm thinking about, in the same way that I think what's actually going on is that, broadly speaking, if we talk about the central Mediterranean route, we're not just talking about Maltese government policy, we're talking about EU policy and EU member state policy. The policy has been quietly to make the route more dangerous. Yes, so they've withdrawn assets, they've done less rescue, the route has become more dangerous. And when you hear the political elite talking, occasionally the tongue slips and they say, we've got less arrivals now. You know, they recognize that by doing less rescue, they don't necessarily say making the route more dangerous, but effectively that's what's happened. The route has become more dangerous. And so it's so we have, I mean, flows have decreased at times because the route has gotten more dangerous, and we have less arrivals in theory because the route has gotten more dangerous. I mean, the likelihood of dying from when you depart from Libya has, I don't know if you have the figure in your head, Cetta, but it's multiplied like 10 times in 5 years or something like that. Yes, but a correlated logic is, again, to echo something that the migration ambassador was saying, a correlated logic that the government uses is that because we have so few, because we accept or acknowledge so few asylum applications, because we have such a low rate of granting any form of asylum, yes, which it's like 1% in Malta at the moment. 1% of the people who apply for asylum in the past few years have gotten any form of documentation or protection. And the ambassador spoke about this as a deterrent, proudly as a deterrent, right? So it's what do we really have is we have governments making things more violent and dangerous at sea, and more violent and dangerous on land for people that arrive and are never able to secure any documentation and never have any stable status in this country. And that's conscious government policy aimed at deterring irregular migrant arrivals. Yeah.
And then they just focus on arrival. It's just like, well, they probably don't talk about other EU nationals, and they will do in the UK. But I guess in Malta, it's not such a focus on, oh, there's so many Spanish people here or anything. It's just African, Asian people, right?
And there, as Danny mentioned earlier, there has been this big labor migration program rolled out by the government, which invites people, I mean, on very exploitative terms, right? It's a model of exploitation, but the spectacle of crisis and deterrence is not built around those forms of migration. Malta also welcomes over 2 million tourists to the island every year. Yes. there's as we've said, this racist line about what is made a crisis out of. And I think it's a good, we've talked a lot about Malta and its policies and its actions, which is right, but it's important also to place that within the wider EU. This is EU policy, right? This is EU practice and policy. It's not out of step with that. Danny.
And it's EU practice and policy which places a burden on frontline member states. That's worth saying. You know, I'm not here to echo government rhetoric on this, but it is worth saying that you can look at other places in the Mediterranean where EU policy has essentially caused small places, small islands to become migrant detention facilities for the EU, yes? And so you can understand the logic of the Maltese government trying to resist that imposition of becoming a gatekeeper and the first stop point where, you know, Malta becomes a migrant housing center for the EU. And also that in many ways, EU government policy, I mean, it's hard, it's splitting hairs, but when you look at Frontex and its very likely coordination with the Libyan Coast Guard, it's probably more instrumental in the number of forced returns, interceptions and forced returns than the Maltese government's coordination is. And the Italians as well, the Italian government has very special relations with Libya, as we know, going back historically, and so I'm not in any way trying to excuse the Maltese position. I'm just echoing what Cetta said and trying to nest it in this broader, continental injustice.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I understand what you mean, and yeah, it does seem like it's like the Dublin Agreement, right? And that forces the burden on southern European countries to keep them away from the north. You mentioned Frontex. Most people will know that's the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. I have several episodes on the podcast about them, and I mentioned probably every single one. So how are you both doing for time? Are you doing okay for time?
Yeah, I did. I know we're running long. You're not going to be able to stop us talking.
No, it's good. It's good.
But I did think it was worth highlighting. It relates to Malta's practice, attempted practice to deter, as well as its pushback policy, about what it means for people if they don't arrive in Malta, if they are contained in Libya, and what it means for them if they are pushed back to Libya as well. So often the government talks about the voyage, the voyage across the Mediterranean as being dangerous. They sometimes have talked about their policies of deterrence and containment being policies that are saving lives at sea. And so I think it's worth saying, one, that of course people take these dangerous voyages because they don't have another way. They cannot get on a plane as we would here. So EU policy, Maltese government policy produces these dangerous journeys. But also the pushing people back to Libya, the kind of collaboration and cooperation we've seen by Malta with the Libyans, by Italy with the Libyans, by the EU with the Libyans, is an attempt to contain people in Libya and to obviously get the Libyan Coast Guard, the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, to refoul people, to push people back at sea, to do that dirty work for Malta, for Italy, for the EU. And what we know about Libya is that it is a place where people face extreme human rights abuses, rape, torture, inhuman and degrading treatment. And that is well documented evidence for many years now. We know the abuses and the conditions that people face in Libya. And so, yes, what the government doesn't say is that when it deters people, when it pushes people back at sea, it means people are contained in a place where they are subject to these kinds of human rights abuses.
Yeah, and just extending that, that's absolutely right. I'm glad we come to Libya. I think there's a lot to say about it. First and foremost is that Libya is not doesn't have a unitary government. Libya tends to be black box for people in the sense that it's a bit hard to know what's going on inside Libya, and it's just not well covered in the mainstream news. And so it's amazing how little people know about what's going on in Libya generally. But generally speaking, there's no unified government, and there are a number of militias that sort of ebb and flow in power. And just for example, just in the past few months, we had violence in Tripoli again as the various militias and their foreign backers, Turkey being one of the main foreign backers in the Tripoli government, they fought it out and had a bit of a mini civil war in Tripoli. And so that's fairly perpetual. In the west of the country, you've got these militias that are constantly vying for power in a sort of post-Gaddafi environment. And in the east of the country, you've got General Haftar, who's come to power as a military strongman and has backing from Egypt and some of the Gulf states. And so Libya's become if Libya isn't still in civil war, then it's sort of constantly verging on going back to civil war, and you've got these major powers playing out a proxy war, from the Italians and the French to the Turks and the Gulf states, and so it's a highly complex, highly unstable place. And if we talk about the Libyan Coast Guard and the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, they are also not a unitary entity. They're not a singular thing. It's really a patchwork of militias from the east to the west of the country, and there's mountains of documentation at this point, mountains of evidence that shows that these militias that are operating Libyan Coast Guard vessels and operating as part of the Libyan Coast Guard are also running detention facilities where migrants experience these extreme human rights violations, and they're also deeply involved with smuggling and smuggling networks. And so there's a closed loop system in some cases where the same militia that carries out an interception and forced return from the Maltese search and rescue zone, which is part financed and armed, equipped by EU member states, Malta and Italy. They will drag people back to a detention facility that they themselves have an invested interest in, that they run. And the people will then purchase their next voyage or their next attempt to come to Europe from within the migrant facility, from within the detention facility, from the very same militia, and then they'll be smuggled out, possibly by the same militia, and intercepted by the same militia. So you've got militias which are making money on all sides. So you've got one militia, and they'll be making money on funding from the EU to carry out interception and forced returns. They'll be making money torturing, raping people, and extorting them, because there's a lot of extortion for money in Libyan detention facilities. So they make money that way. Then they make money on getting paid for the voyage. And then they just capture the same people and bring them back to their own detention facility. So that's a bit of an extreme example, but that is very likely what's happening in many of these circumstances. And we could bring up examples like the head of the Libyan Coast Guard in Tripoli. He was killed, I think, last year. Now I'm trying to remember his name. Milad. It's on the tip of my tongue, but was sanctioned by the UN for gross human rights violations and being a smuggler, basically. These details aren't hard to find. So as Cetta said, I'm just trying to paint this picture of what really the Europeans have done in order to they've sort of parachuted or set up a Libyan Coast Guard entity that they call the Libyan Coast Guard, but it's really just this hodgepodge of militias. And they're doing it essentially because it would be illegal to forcibly return people ourselves. The AFM would not forcibly return people to Libya because it's an unsafe place, yes, and they would undoubtedly experience inhumane and degrading treatment. And so we've essentially created these entities or partnered with these malicious smugglers in order to do that work for us. At great expense, yes. I think Cetta said 21,000 people were forcibly returned to Libya last year from the central Mediterranean, and it's important to think about what happened to those people. Yes, like significant numbers of them will have died in Libyan detention. Many of them will have tried the journey again and again and are still in Libyan detention now. Yes, it's and so maybe we can turn now to a case that kind of highlights this. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about it more broadly or abstractly, either of you.
No. I was just going to say there's a really good book, and we've had one of the authors on the podcast. It's called Doro, and it's with, you might know him. He's one of the authors is Brendan Woodhouse, who's been on the podcast twice. He's an activist with Sea-Watch. He wrote the book with Doro, and that book, we talk about it in the interview with him on the podcast, but Doro talks about being tortured and how he's exploited and extorted for money. It's really awful, and I think it's really well worth reading if you haven't. Let's talk about this case, but I'm pushed for time at the moment. But yeah, let's talk about this case, and then we'll move on towards the end of the podcast.
But I'll tear through it rather quickly. So we've been talking about instances of interceptions and forced returns from the Maltese search and rescue zone, and the case I'm going to speak about was a case also from 2023, 7th of July 2023, and in this case there were 250 people on a large wooden fishing vessel. If you go to our website, if you go to the Malta Migration Archive.org, then I'm talking about case DC 22. You can find it on the list of cases. Also occurred in the far southeast of the Maltese search and rescue zone. Alarm phone got a call from these 250 people on board this fishing vessel. You see a photo of the fishing vessel itself, which is heavily overloaded with people, on our website, which was taken by the Seabird 1. So the Seabird 1 was on the scene, and just cutting the long story short, communicated with a number of merchant vessels that were in the region, in this case one of them called the San Felix. Just like in the last case we had, the San Felix responded after a couple of hours and said, the Maltese Rescue Coordination Center has taken over responsibility for this case, and they've advised us to go back to our original journey, that is to move away from the distress case. And within an hour or two of, that actually happens, within an hour or two of the Seabird, the Sea-Watch plane, being notified that the Maltese Coordination Center had taken responsibility for the case, a Libyan militia vessel appears on the scene. The militia is called the Tariq Ben Zayed Brigade, and it's associated with Khalifa Haftar in the east of the country. It's sort of one of the main militias in his security architecture in the east of the country. Also is being tracked and analyzed by the UN. A number of reports having incriminated it, gross human rights violations and associations with smuggling, human rights violations against migrants and smuggling associations. Essentially what happens is fairly quickly after the Maltese Coordination Center takes over responsibility, the Tariq Ben Zayed Brigade comes up into the Maltese search and rescue zone, forcibly intercepts the migrant vessel. The Sea-Watch plane tries to communicate with it and pull it off and say this is a violation of international law and so on, but they carry out the forced interception anyway. And let's see, basically the people on board were forcibly returned to detention in Benghazi. They had all their belongings taken from them. I believe Alarm Phone was in touch with the people on board or some of their family members after they were returned to detention. And the whole case occurred just a few months after. Really, in the summer of 2023, we see a flurry of activity from the Tariq Ben Zayed Brigade coming into the Maltese Search and Rescue Zone, doing these illegal, unethical, forced interceptions. And that activity comes just a few months after the Maltese government sent a delegation to meet Haftar and to discuss migration management, quote unquote migration management. We also just moving away from the case specifically, the Maltese government also signed a memorandum of understanding with the Tripoli government some years back, in which coordination centers were set up. So the Maltese government runs a coordination center in Tripoli, and those two agreements really clearly laid the foundation for the logistical coordination which has taken place since then. And then in the summer of 2020, I think really in the past few years, it's been the first time that as researchers and activists and journalists, there's been conclusive evidence that the Maltese government is sharing GPS coordinates with militias in Libya, with members of the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, for them to come up into the search and rescue zone and forcibly return people. That evidence has been hard to come by. I mean, the government is deeply, deeply invested in keeping that secret because they know that it's likely highly illegal. So, for example, when I spoke to when I had the opportunity to hear a Maltese ambassador on migration speaking last week, he threw out what I thought was a real smokescreen. He said something about how Malta doesn't actually have jurisdiction for what happens within its search and rescue zone, right? This is the government's line, that if the Tariq Ben Said Brigade wants to come up into a search and rescue zone on its own account and drag people back to Libya, we don't have jurisdiction to prevent them from doing that, which I took as just such a bold-faced lie. I mean, it begs the question, why would the Tariq Ben Said Brigade come into our search and rescue zone and intercept people and forcibly return to Libya, if not because of some coordination that because we're sharing GPS coordinates, because there's coordination with them, because we want them to do it, obviously. Yes, there's no particular interest in a Libyan militia coming into our search and rescue zone, intercepting migrants and returning them to Libya, yeah?
Yeah, that case is really indicative of like what's happening with the Libyan Coast Guard, right? It's just, and you can see, and like you said, it's obvious why they're keeping it secret, because they know like that is such a massive violation of international human rights, as far as I understand.
Right. That's right. So, sorry, Ben, to cut you off, because then I dropped my train of thought there. So then after this smokescreen commentary that he made at this conference, I pointedly asked him, well, can you tell me, does the Maltese government share GPS coordinates with any of the members of the so-called Libyan Coast Guard so that they can come and do interception and forced return from our search and rescue zone? And he said, I'm not involved in logistical matters, and I don't know the answer to that question. And so you've got one of the highest ranking Maltese government members on migration saying effectively, I can't tell you that, because of course he knows.
Yeah, that is wild. Absolutely. It's just, yeah, it's unbelievable. The situation, like I always find it every time I do a podcast, I'm like, yeah, I've heard it all, it's not going to shock me, and then it always does. It's just like unbelievably crazy. I don't know, Cetta, was there anything you wanted to add to that one? Anything you thought was worth exploring?
I think I would just maybe zoom out and say, in this moment, in this global moment of increasing authoritarianism, increasing violence that we see, wars, but also violence against people on the move, that it's really important, and that it's really important that we look to the people who are trying to uphold a sense of international law, of peace, of human rights, of decency, right? Of some moral decency around the type of world we want to live in, the type of communities that we want to live in, and that just because the kind of violent pushbacks Danny's talking about happens out at sea in a place where the government keeps it hidden, it doesn't mean it doesn't affect our societies. It doesn't mean we're not complicit in that. Yes. Yes, so I think about this moment being, a flashpoint in terms of the type of world that we want to live in, the type of, and how we can fight against these violent policies that our governments in the UK, in Malta, elsewhere, are trying to enact in our name.
Yeah, it's really... We're living in a crazy time. I think it's like the governments just don't seem to be interested in following international law anymore. I think you could argue that's always been the case, but now it's so clear. It's really hard to hide. Sorry, Daniel. I think you're muted.
You're still muted.
Oh, I just said the most profound thing I said the whole podcast. No, I just wanted to talk about go global, like you just did, Cetta, and say that if you take a global perspective, there are really fascinating connections to be made here. Not only, for example, we could talk about Libya and all the different players, all the different international players that have a vested interest in seeing Libya turn one way or another. But I'm thinking about the military-industrial complex and its role as a driving force in our world, spiraling into war, and the rise of fascism really across the West, maybe across the world, and just a pithy example, I think, is that Frontex uses Heron drones. Heron drones are operated by are developed by the IDF, or by an Israeli company, and they're the same drones, for example, that were likely buzzing the Freedom Flotilla vessel as it moved toward Gaza recently, and the same drones that are used for reconnaissance across Gaza. That's obviously been devastated in over a year of genocide now, and so there are really deep interconnections, and there are very big vested interests in migration management. Yes, people are making a lot of money in migration management, whether they are on the quote unquote enforcement side, or whether they are so-called Libyan coastguard militias that are extorting people for money in detention centers, and yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I often think of it, and maybe this is wrong, but like the circular trade of the British slave, when the Atlantic slave trade and Britain's involvement in that, it kind of feels like we're living through something somewhat similar where, like, I imagine that I haven't looked into this deeply. I'm sure there's people who have, but the arms companies create refugees, and then there's probably similar or the same companies making money from borders. It's just like, it's absolutely crazy. Yeah, what a time to be alive. So let's move on towards the end here. Like, I feel like we could talk for ages. I'm really enjoying this larger global chat as well. If I didn't have to go, I'd like to continue much longer. But I was thinking when I was looking at the map, I was like, this would be really good, like in like a museum setting, or you could tour it. I have absolutely no idea how you do that, but I don't know. Do you have any plans to do anything like that, or like, do you have concrete or vague plans for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, we're really excited to have launched it out into the world and to be getting feedback from people. We really welcome any feedback people have. We have an email address on the archive website that you're welcome to get in touch with us. As Danny said, we really hope that this is a project that will evolve and that will be collaborative, continue to be collaborative. We're really open to different forms of collaboration, and we really hope that it's a resource different people can use, researchers, lawyers, journalists, activists. We hope that it's a resource. And yeah, absolutely. I had a similar thought when we were launching it, that we could tour it as an exhibition. We haven't gotten further than just thinking that would be good. Also to connect it, right, to other places. So in the UK and with the Channel crossings, as you've mentioned, to connect what's happening in the Mediterranean, these practices of the Maltese government with other government practices, but also other forms of resistance, right? The connected up forms of resistance, alarm phone, for instance, being active across the Channel as well as across the Mediterranean is where the hope lies, you know, to go back also to that global authoritarian fascist moment. I think the hope lies in people who are saying, not in my name, and who are joining together to try and create safer spaces.
That's a great answer. I don't know, Daniel, you're muted, just so you know. But I wondered if there's anything you wanted to add.
No, I think Cetta covered the bases on that one. Yeah.
Great. And then, so my last question I like to ask people is, how do you feel about the future going forward in terms of migration? And I guess we can focus on Malta, or you can take it globally if you like. It's nice to have a bit of optimism in this question, but if you haven't got any, that's fine. But yeah, it often feels like just everything's going in the wrong direction all the time. But I wondered if you could, I don't know, how do you feel about the future?
Yeah, I think that, you know, the hope doesn't lie with mainstream political parties. So what I see in the UK, in Malta, across, in the US, across a lot of Western countries, on the issue of migration, is this lack of vision about a different sort of rhetoric, a different sort of approach. So we see the same broken approach being taken again and again, right? Focused around deterrence, around borders, and we know that's a broken, failed approach. We know it costs money, we know it causes harm, causes people to die, and we know it doesn't work. We know that people continue to come, continue to make these journeys. And so, yes, when I think about where people are envisioning different futures, it is not at that political level, at that mainstream government political level. I think broadly, with some few exceptions, the left has tried to mimic the right on this, on the question of migration, and hasn't provided any different vision or narrative. And we definitely see that in Malta, where, I mean, as Danny said, the Labour Party, a very centre-left party now, has been in power for a long time. It's a two-party system. The Labour and the Nationalist Party, left and right, have had similar positions on migration based around deterrence and violent policies. I think where the hope lies is in grassroots organizing in the civil fleet in the Mediterranean, in grassroots organizing in Malta and elsewhere, where people are actually enacting a different society and definitely envisioning a different future where people are more equal, where people have more freedoms, where people are cared for.
Yeah, I think I always find hope in like what activists and people are doing, rather than absolutely not in our Labour government in the UK. But and Parliament just doesn't seem to be the way at the moment. But I think direct action and these kind of things have really given me a lot of hope. How about you, Daniel?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer with optimism, because in migration work in Malta and in migration activism in Malta, it sure feels like things have gone from bad to worse in the past decade, and it feels like an uphill battle. And I would say that's broadly true of the scene internationally when we talk about migration issues, and when we think about a rising tide of fascism and just what seems like an abandonment of human rights values in many places across the world by some of the leading powers, and so it's a difficult time to be optimistic. But nonetheless, we have to try, don't we? And I think the real optimism, as Cetta suggested, comes from the grassroots up, and I have faith that that people are inherently good, and that that normal people just want to live safe lives with their loved ones, and be able to just aspire to a little bit of growth and upward mobility, and that ultimately love and compassion are inherent to the human experience, and so I find hope in hope. Quite honestly, I think that when you think about a person that has tried to leave Libya 5 times and is back in a detention facility, and they have literally nothing. They have no papers, they don't have their freedom, they don't perhaps speak the language that they need to function, they have literally nothing. It's very difficult for us in our privileged state to imagine that state of vulnerability and neglect. And ultimately, what those people have left is hope, and I find that sort of such a powerful expression of the tenacity of the human spirit, and with this individual hope that people seem to be able to hold on to, there's also the milk of human solidarity, and the more you do this work, and the more you get involved with people. I'm thinking, for example, of David Yambio. David Yambio is somebody that I look up tremendously. I don't know if he's been on the podcast, but he's been on the podcast, and he's a man who's had his own personal experience, traumatic experience as a migrant, and he exemplifies this milk of human solidarity for me, and he gives me great hope, and it's working with people like him on the ground, and recognizing the solidarity in love and care, and also recognizing resistance, and that resistance continues, and fundamentally we see it continuing in simply the fact that people continue to use this migration pathway, despite that it's the most dangerous migration pathway in the world, despite that the authorities have tried to make it purposefully, have tried to make it more dangerous. Yes, there's solidarity all along their journey as they travel, and their solidarity in the sea, despite the complete absence of any real functional government assets, rescue operations. And that gives me hope.
Well, that's good. That's made me feel a lot better. You've given me a lot of hope here, given me some optimism. That's great. Thank you very much. Well, it's Cetta and Daniel. That was a really, really great interview. It's probably one of the longest we've done on here. I really enjoyed it. I think we can keep talking. It's a shame to cut it, but I've got other things to do now, as I'm sure you two do as well. But yeah, so thank you so much for your time. That was really, really great.
Thanks so much for having us on, Ben. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben. Great to chat with you.
And like one last plug for the archive to all the listeners out there, check out the Malta Migration Archive.org. See what you can learn from it. See if you can contribute something to it.
Okay, that was episode 72 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Thank you very, very much for listening. Thanks again to Cetta and Daniel for speaking to us and telling us all about the amazing Malta Migration Archive. Do check out the show notes. There's tons in this episode, and you can learn more. You'll find a link to the website, which is maltamigrationarchive.org. But yeah, look at the show notes and you'll find all of that stuff. We've also got another episode in the works, which should be coming out very, very soon as well. If you've been following us on social media, you might see who's in that one. Okay, so it's the end of the podcast. At the end of the podcast, we normally talk about, go check out the blog, go to civilfleet.com, where you can find investigative stories, news reports and interviews. Also, if you want to help us to keep the lights on, as it were, to help us to continue to platform the amazing people that we have had on this podcast, then you can do two things. You can put your money where your mouth is, and you can make a micro donation to the Civil Fleet. If you go to co-fi.com/Civil Fleet, you can sign up there and give a small donation, or you can give a massive one if you like. And if you can't do that, that's cool, no worries, I don't mind. I do this for free anyway. You can give us a share, you can tell your friends about it, give it to a professor, someone you know at university, someone you work, someone you hate, give it to your grandma even. Spread the word of the podcast, give us a rating and all that crap. And that will help us to continue. We're on YouTube too. If you're listening to this on your headphones, not on your phone or something, you can find us on YouTube if you like, where you can like and subscribe and do all that stuff that YouTubers say. Right, that's it for episode 72. Episode 73 is already in the works, so be on the lookout for that. And yeah, catch you later. Bye bye.